On the afternoon of April 13th, 1945, one day after Franklin Roosevelt's sudden death, a small group of Army officers gathered nervously in the corridors of the White House. They had come to brief the new president, Harry S. Truman, on the situation in Europe, the final days of the war, the collapse of Nazi defenses, and the movements of the Red Army across the continent. And while each officer knew the briefing would touch on strategy, logistics, and diplomacy, there was one subject they expected the president to ask about immediately: General George S. Patton. Even in Washington, far from the battlefields of Europe, Patton's name carried weight, admiration, controversy, and anxiety in equal measure. His victories were undeniable, his temper equally so, and his ability to electrify troops had always walked hand in hand with a capacity to alarm the political class. Patton was one of the most brilliant battlefield commanders the United States had ever produced, but he was also a man who spoke faster than Washington could contain. Before we go further, tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from, and if you enjoy content like this, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next video. Truman, still adjusting to the shock of his new role, walked into the cabinet room and took his seat. He listened carefully as the generals briefed him. The Germans were near collapse, Allied forces were converging on Bavaria, and thousands of American soldiers were preparing for what everyone assumed would be the final push. Then Truman asked the question they had been waiting for. Where does General Patton stand on all this? It was the beginning of a relationship that would define one of the quietest yet most consequential tensions of Truman's presidency, a relationship rooted not in personality alone, but in two fundamentally different visions of what leadership meant in the fragile world emerging from the war. The officers exchanged glances before answering. One finally spoke. "Mr. President, General Patton remains aggressive in his operational thinking. He believes the Germans are finished, but he is concerned about Soviet intentions." Truman nodded. He had been briefed on Stalin, on the Soviet occupation zones, on Roosevelt's final agreements at Yalta, but hearing Patton's name attached to concerns about the Soviets, the very allies America had fought alongside for years, was something else entirely. Truman leaned back and asked for further detail. The officer continued. "The general has expressed the view that we may have to prepare for difficulties with the Russians sooner than later." Truman raised an eyebrow. "Difficulties? The war isn't even over." The officer hesitated. "General Patton believes peace will not hold, sir." That sentence sat in the air like a warning bell. In the days following Roosevelt's death, Truman was absorbing more information than any man could have prepared for. He learned about the atomic bomb, about secret agreements Roosevelt had never shared with him, about the fragile balance between the Allies. And now he was hearing that one of America's most famous commanders was already thinking past Hitler, toward the next confrontation. Truman did not respond immediately. He simply said, "I'll need more information on Patton's thinking." But the truth was this: he already suspected there would be a problem. Truman admired discipline. He admired loyalty. He admired clarity. Patton embodied all of these things, but in ways Truman viewed as dangerous outside of war. Patton's discipline was absolute on the battlefield, but flexible when it came to hierarchy. His loyalty was fierce, but directed more toward his soldiers than toward any political authority. And his clarity, so effective in war, risked destabilizing the fragile peace Truman had inherited. The president had not yet formed an opinion of Patton the man, but he was already forming an opinion of Patton, the challenge. Days passed. Germany surrendered. Truman addressed the nation. Celebrations erupted across the United States as the war in Europe officially ended. But behind the scenes, Truman's advisors were already warning him that the post-war landscape would be more complicated than the victory parades suggested. And at the center of that complexity stood men like Patton, heroes of the battlefield whose instincts did not easily translate to occupation, reconstruction, or diplomacy. Truman finally read through Patton's full personnel file in May 1945. It was a thick collection of evaluations, commendations, complaints, victories, controversies, and statements that ranged from visionary to incendiary. Truman read page after page quietly. He saw the brilliance, the boldness, the operational genius. He saw the slapping incident. He saw concerns from Army staff. He saw the public remarks that had caused headaches for Roosevelt. But Truman wasn't Roosevelt. Where Roosevelt had learned to tolerate Patton, Truman approached the matters with a colder practicality. When he finished reading, he told an aide, A man can win a war and still not know how to manage the peace. Still, he did not intervene, not yet. Truman wanted to observe Patton on his own terms. The general was now serving under Eisenhower in the occupation administration. Truman had received recommendations, reports, and advice from every corner of Washington, but he always preferred to judge character himself. So, he waited. The first direct sign of trouble came in early June, when Truman received a cable summarizing one of Patton's comments to the press. Patton had questioned the severity of the denazification process, suggesting that many German administrators were necessary for the functioning of local government, even those with prior Nazi Party membership. Truman put the cable down slowly. Removing former Nazis from authority was not just a policy, it was the foundation of Allied legitimacy in occupied Germany. Any deviation risked undermining the moral basis of the entire post-war reconstruction effort. He called his military liaison. "Does General Patton understand the implications of what he's saying?" The liaison hesitated. "Sir, General Patton understands the implications. He simply disagrees with them." It was the first moment Truman felt the stirrings of something deeper than concern. It felt like a looming collision. Weeks passed. Truman held meetings. He oversaw the founding of the United Nations. He received updates on Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan. He faced pressure from Congress, demands from allies, and the constant stream of diplomatic signals from Moscow. But every few days, without fail, another memo crossed his desk with Patton's name on it. Some memos were minor, others described conflicts with administrators. A few described heated exchanges with British officials. But one memo, written in late August, made Truman sit up straighter in his chair. It summarized comments Patton had made privately during a staff briefing in Bavaria, comments suggesting the United States might eventually need to prepare for confrontation with the Soviet Union, and that Germany could be a necessary ally in that confrontation. Truman closed the file. He looked out the window. He understood the gravity of what he had just read. This was no longer a matter of Patton disagreeing with policy. This was a matter of Patton openly articulating a vision for Europe that contradicted the entire Allied framework. Truman did not call Patton. He did not send a reprimand. He waited for Eisenhower's assessment. It came 5 days later. Eisenhower's letter was measured, diplomatic, and careful. Not because Eisenhower feared Patton, but because he respected Truman and wanted to be fair. He explained that Patton's battlefield achievements remained without equal, but his statements about the Germans and the Soviets were becoming a distraction. More importantly, they were undermining Allied cohesion. Truman read the letter twice. He did not respond immediately. He simply placed it on his desk and rested his hand on the cover. He sat like that for nearly a minute, still and silent. He understood what Eisenhower was implying. Patton was becoming untenable, not for lack of courage, not for lack of brilliance, not for lack of patriotism, but because Patton represented the world as it had been, violent, immediate, decisive, while Truman was responsible for the world that now had to be built. That difference was vast and irreconcilable. Yet Truman still hesitated to act. He felt a responsibility not only to the stability of Europe, but to fairness. He needed to know what Patton intended. He needed clarity. He needed context. So, he requested private back-channel communications, detailed reports from officers who worked directly with Patton, summaries of meetings, temperamental evaluations, and assessments of Patton's willingness or unwillingness to align with civilian authority. The patterns were unmistakable. Patton was not disloyal. Patton was not insubordinate. Patton was simply incompatible with the kind of peace Truman had to build. That is when the irony became clear. Truman admired Patton more than anyone realized. He admired his courage. He admired his conviction. He admired his refusal to bend when he believed something was wrong. But Truman also understood something Patton never had to confront. A post-war world could collapse faster than a wartime one. And one man's instincts, even brilliant instincts, could unravel everything. By September 1945, the internal conflict within Truman had reached its peak. Advisors urged action. Diplomats warned of consequences. The British pressed for stability. The Soviets watched for weakness. Europe teetered on the edge of famine and political unrest. And Patton, in the middle of it all, kept speaking with the clarity of a man who saw only the problems in front of him, not the diplomatic tightrope Truman was walking. The breaking point did not come from any single comment. It came from a pattern Truman could no longer ignore. And when Eisenhower finally sent a formal recommendation for Patton's removal, Truman recognized the truth he had been resisting for months. He agreed. The decision would end Patton's operational command. It would end his influence on Germany. It would end the possibility of reconciling two visions of the world that could never coexist. And it would end something else, something Truman had never said aloud, his admiration. Truman did not respond immediately. He rarely did. His instinct was to gather, to listen, to absorb. But as more reports came in, some describing Patton's frustrations with occupation policy, others detailing the growing impatience among Allied officials, Truman began to form an opinion he would never put directly into words. He respected Patton's courage. He admired his battlefield clarity, but he also believed that every great strength, when misplaced, became a liability. To Truman, Patton's genius was forged for a moment that no longer existed. Meanwhile, Europe was reshaping itself by the week. The Nuremberg trials were underway. The Allied Control Council met endlessly to determine everything from currency stabilization to food rationing. Soviet attitudes were hardening, and American diplomats warned that every misstep would be exploited by Moscow for propaganda. Patton saw these developments through the eyes of a commander trained to anticipate the next attack. Truman saw them through the eyes of a man responsible for preventing the next war. This difference, subtle at first, then overwhelming, became the foundation of Truman's growing concern. He did not dislike Patton, but he feared the consequences of Patton's instincts. In mid-September, Truman met privately with several senior advisors. They described in detail how Patton's comments about former Nazi officials were being circulated across Europe. One advisor explained that Soviet newspapers had already begun using excerpts from Patton's remarks to argue that America had no intention of truly dismantling fascism. Another pointed out that French officials, already struggling to stabilize their post-war government, feared that Patton's statements undermined Allied unity. A third warned that British leaders, still dealing with their own occupation responsibilities, felt Patton was jeopardizing their efforts to maintain civilian trust. Truman listened without interrupting. He tapped his pencil lightly against the notepad in front of him, the same gesture he made when weighing decisions of significant consequence. Finally, he asked one question. Is Patton helping or hurting the mission? The room fell quiet. The answer, unspoken but undeniable, marked the beginning of the end. Patton, meanwhile, sensed the shift long before any official order arrived. He noticed certain meetings no longer included him. He noticed that directives he once shaped were now written without his input. He noticed that Eisenhower, whose friendship he valued deeply, spoke to him with the careful restraint of a commander navigating political terrain. To Patton, the problem was simple. He believed he was right. He believed denazification, as written, was impossible to execute without paralyzing German administration. He believed the Soviets were taking advantage of Allied hesitation. He believed Germany needed to be rebuilt quickly, intelligently, and with support from skilled civilians, regardless of their prior affiliations. But Patton's belief in being right was matched only by his inability to temper his delivery. He spoke the same way he commanded, directly, forcefully, without considering the diplomatic aftershocks. Truman understood the intention, but Truman could not accept the impact. In one particularly tense moment, a classified cable reached Washington describing how Patton had referred to certain Allied political directives as the work of people who have never been nearer to a battlefield than a typewriter. The remark spread quickly, reaching London within hours. British officials contacted Truman's staff demanding clarification. Truman read the cable, set it aside, and stared out of the Oval Office window for a long time. Privately, he agreed with parts of Patton's assessment. The occupation was indeed complicated. Many policy writers had never seen combat. Many had underestimated the complexity of rebuilding Europe. But Truman also knew that all of these criticisms, if spoken aloud, unfiltered, and attributed to a man of Patton's stature, could fracture the alliance holding Europe together. Patton believed he was cutting through confusion. Truman believed Patton was adding to it. By late September, the gap between them became irreversible. Eisenhower visited Washington for meetings with Truman and the Joint Chiefs. During their private conversation, Eisenhower spoke carefully but candidly. He described Patton's loyalty, his brilliance, his battlefield record, but also his unpredictability, his refusal to adapt, and the increasing difficulty of justifying his remarks to Allied partners. Truman asked Eisenhower a question he had asked no one else. If he stays where he is, will the mission suffer? Eisenhower paused, then he nodded. That was all Truman needed. He did not celebrate the clarity. He did not relish the authority. But he understood what the moment demanded. Still, one thought troubled him deeply. What would happen to Patton after the decision? Truman did not want to humiliate him. He did not want to tarnish his wartime legacy. He did not want newspapers turning Patton's reassignment into a spectacle. So, Truman instructed his staff to act quietly, with dignity, with the same respect he had shown every fallen soldier he honored. Patton received the order without theatrics. Those who were present described his reaction as controlled but tense. He nodded, stood, and simply said, "Very well." But those close to him noticed the shift. For the first time in years, Patton had nowhere to direct his energy. No campaign, no battlefield, no enemy to outmaneuver. He had been built for a world of movement and momentum. Now he found himself in a world that demanded patience and restraint. He wrote to Beatrice, his wife, that he felt like a violin player whose strings have all been cut. And in Washington, Truman read updates about Patton's reassignment with a heaviness that surprised even himself. He had made difficult decisions before, about weapons, alliances, occupations, and the end of the war itself. But removing Patton from command held a particular weight. It felt personal, even though it wasn't. It felt like the end of something necessary, even though Truman wished it weren't. The truth was simple and painful. Truman respected Patton. He admired him. But he could not allow him to shape the peace. Not in that moment, not in that fragile world. Not with history watching so closely. What Truman thought of Patton was not hatred. It was something far more difficult. It was recognition of greatness, of limits, and of the consequences that come when those two collide. And that recognition, more than anger or disappointment, is what ended everything. In the final weeks of 1945, as winter settled over Europe and Washington braced for a new and uncertain era, Harry Truman found himself reflecting on General George S. Patton with a mixture of admiration, regret, and unspoken sadness. For months he had wrestled with the question the few understood. What do you do with a genius who no longer fits the world he helped create? The war had needed Patton. The peace could not contain him. By the time Truman approved Patton's reassignment, the decision felt inevitable, but inevitable decisions still carry weight, and as the cables arrived reporting Patton's movements, his remarks, his growing frustration, Truman felt the heaviness of watching a man built for fire be forced to walk through ash. Patton's death in December struck Truman harder than anyone publicly knew, not because they had been close, they hadn't, but because Truman understood what it meant to be misunderstood. He understood what it meant to fight battles privately that the public would never see. And he understood that, despite everything, Patton had been one of the sharpest instruments America ever wielded. In the months after Patton's passing, Truman tried to think of him not in terms of controversy, but in terms of contribution. He remembered the speed of the Lorraine advance, the daring sweep across France, the relief of Bastogne, the way Patton's presence alone could lift the morale of exhausted soldiers. Truman, who had felt unprepared for the presidency, found something deeply relatable in Patton's willingness to charge forward even when clarity was scarce. Yet Truman also knew the truth that history would eventually record. Patton's instincts were not wrong. They were simply incompatible with the world Truman was trying to build. In early 1946, as the structure of the post-war order began to take form, Truman finally saw the full shape of the new conflict looming ahead. The one Patton had warned about. The one many in Washington still resisted acknowledging. Soviet pressure in Eastern Europe was increasing. Poland was tightening under Moscow's grip. Romania's political transformation accelerated. Bulgaria's opposition leaders were disappearing. Truman could no longer dismiss these patterns as natural post-war instability. They were coordinated, intentional, strategic. He remembered then a memo Patton had written weeks before his reassignment, one Truman had reviewed but set aside. In it, Patton argued bluntly that Germany must be stabilized quickly to prevent Soviet expansion. At the time, Truman had viewed the memo as an oversimplification. Now, he saw elements of foresight, not a solution, but a warning. Truman did not adopt Patton's worldview, but he did absorb his urgency. This subtle shift, this moment when Truman began viewing Europe not only as a place in ruins, but as a place in danger, would shape every major decision that followed. The Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, the origins of NATO, and the commitment to resisting authoritarian expansion wherever it emerged. And in this sense, Patton's influence lived on in Truman's presidency in a way the general never knew. Not in direct policy, not in strategy, but in the recognition that peace, if left unattended, could become the breeding ground for the next global crisis. By spring 1946, Truman spoke more openly in private about the Soviet threat. He instructed his advisors to prepare for a long-term competition of ideologies, not a temporary disagreement between wartime allies. He dismissed the belief, still held by a few Roosevelt-era diplomats, that cooperation would naturally resume. The world had changed, and Truman was no longer trying to preserve a fragile peace. He was trying to defend a shaping future. Would Patton have approved of Truman's evolving worldview? In some ways, yes. Patton would have seen Truman's firmness as overdue. He would have viewed the early Cold War policies as confirmation of his warnings. But Patton would have disagreed with the means. He would have pushed for force, not diplomacy, confrontation, not containment. Truman knew this, and this knowledge reinforced why their break had been necessary. America needed clarity, not escalation. It needed strength without instability, conviction without volatility. And Truman, whatever his private doubts, believed he had struck that balance. In May 1946, Truman received a request to provide remarks at a commemoration honoring American commanders of the European theater. Though he would not attend in person, he prepared a written statement. In it, he praised the commanders who had brought an end to tyranny in Europe and singled out certain generals for their unparalleled leadership in the decisive moments of war. Patton was mentioned prominently, but Truman added something unusual in his draft, something that his staff suggested removing, but he kept. He wrote, "History demands not only victory, but understanding of what victory requires once the battles are won." It was not about Patton directly. It was about the world Patton had predicted but could not shape, and it was about the world Truman had inherited but could not ignore. In the summer of 1946, Truman visited several military bases across the United States. During one visit, a young soldier approached him and asked bluntly whether General Patton had been treated unfairly. The question surprised him. Few spoke so directly to a president. Truman paused, then answered, "General Patton fought for this country with every ounce of strength a man could have. I respected him then, and I respect him now. Sometimes the hardest decisions are not about what a man deserves, but what the world requires." It was the closest Truman ever came to publicly acknowledging the rift. As the Cold War sharpened through 1947 and 1948, Truman's policies began shaping a divided Europe. The Truman Doctrine declared America's commitment to defending free nations. The Marshall Plan rebuilt the economies that might otherwise have fallen under Soviet influence. NATO formalized a military alliance to counterbalance Soviet expansion. Patton was gone by then, but the urgency he had voiced, the urgency that had once alarmed Truman, now echoed through every strategic discussion. In 1949, while preparing notes for a speech on European recovery, Truman reread several wartime documents. Among them was an earlier report summarizing Patton's views on post-war Germany. It was fiery, imprecise, overly aggressive, and yet at its core, it reflected a fear that Truman now shared, that the peace would not hold unless America helped hold it. Truman closed the folder and placed it at the top of his stack. In later years, Truman rarely mentioned Patton by name unless prompted. Their relationship had been too complicated, too fraught with misunderstanding, too deeply shaped by the pressures of 1945. But when he did speak of Patton, Truman chose his words carefully. He never criticized him. He never revisited their conflict. Instead, he honored the general as one of the most important battlefield leaders in American history. Privately, though, Truman admitted something to an aide in 1951, during the height of the Korean War. The aide asked whether Truman believed Patton had been right about the Soviet threat. Truman answered without hesitation. "Patton saw the storm," he said, "but he didn't see the cost of stopping it too soon." That sentence, simple, measured, unembellished, captured the entire essence of their conflict. Patton believed the world needed to act before danger grew. Truman believed the world needed to understand the danger before acting. Both instincts were necessary. Both instincts shaped history, but only one could govern a nation. In 1953, shortly after leaving office, Truman visited the Truman Library for a development meeting. A historian researching wartime command asked him what he truly thought of Patton. Truman smiled faintly. "A man of enormous courage," he said. "A man who wanted to save the world in the only way he knew how." He paused, then added softly, "And if he had lived, he would have seen that the world we built needed him just as much as the war he helped win." It was not flattery, it was recognition. Truman believed Patton had been right about the danger, but wrong about the cure. Patton believed Truman had been too cautious, but never doubted his patriotism. Their conflict had not ended everything. It had shaped everything: the peace, the policies, the world that emerged from the rubble of 1945. In the end, the story of Truman and Patton is not a story of opponents. It is a story of two men standing at the crossroads of history, one forged in the fires of war, the other entrusted with the fragile dawn of peace. One saw danger clearly, the other learned to confront it, and together, though separated by temperament, strategy, and time, they helped shape the world we now inherit. What do you think? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more true stories from the hidden corners of history, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel.